everybody. This is Alan Sherman. I'm from my home in DC. Welcome to our special SFS meeting with Dr. Alyssa Redmiles, who's a security researcher at Microsoft. And she recently earned her PhD from College Park and will soon become a professor at Princeton. Okay, well, go ahead, take over.
Okay, awesome. So very nice to meet all of you. As Alan mentioned, I'm Alyssa, and I completed my PhD in computer science at the University of Maryland this past May. And prior to pursuing my PhD, I got my bachelor's at the University of Maryland College Park also. And then I worked at IBM for a couple of years, first as a software engineer and then actually as a marketing manager before I went back to get my PhD. And doing security was actually sort of an accident in some ways. I knew after having done a little bit of undergraduate research that I was really interested in how human behavior impacted people's decisions to use various types of technological tools. So I started looking at a theoretical project for how to match people in ride-sharing apps, and I realized that the part of the problem I was drawn to was more who would like to share rides together and how that impacted the algorithms than how to design the algorithm itself. And it turned out that that was actually the kind of thinking that fit very well in cybersecurity because, as I'm sure all of you know, there are a lot of human-focused problems in security, both in terms of, why don't users behave securely, as well as, how do developers introduce bugs, how do malware analysts identify malware, and how do we develop tools that can ease all of those processes of the security ecosystem. And so in my PhD, my research primarily focused on security education and basically how people learn to be secure and why they chose to accept or reject advice. And during my process of doing that work, I realized that while educating users to try to get them to do security is interesting, I was most interested in kind of their natural decision-making processes. How were they evaluating risk? How are they evaluating value? How are they making choices? And there's sort of a general perception, I would say, at least at the time, that the choices users made were not rational. They weren't, sitting there and logically computing, okay, it'll cost me 5 minutes a year to do security, but it has a risk of costing me, $1,000 a year, so it would make sense to do security. There's sort of the perception that people, are making those kinds of reasoned choices, but we didn't really know how they were making choices. And so toward the end of my PhD, what I started focusing on was building behavioral economics experiments and models to try to figure out if we could build logistic regression models, or basically, traditional statistics now, sometimes machine learning, models for whether we could predict how someone makes a choice to protect themselves, and then whether we can help security firms use game theory to optimize those choices. Now that I'm at Microsoft, those kinds of considerations are very relevant to enterprises. So Microsoft has some new kind of autonomous security work that we are spinning up, trying to look at things like, if I want to create a certain level of resistance in a firewall, that's going to slow down how long it takes for employees to do certain tasks. And the employees becoming less productive has some cost to some firm. And so how do we trade off between the level of security protection we want to offer and paying to employees? So that's kind of the direction that my research has gone, which is very kind of security behavior plus economics. As sort of side fun in all of this, I've also done some work on machine learning ethics. So when is it fair to use a classifier for certain things? Can we take people's opinions about that into account when we decide to optimize which features are in a classifier? I've looked at security, privacy, and ethics in virtual reality, which is sort of an emerging area where we have a chance to try to make protections before we get to the point that we are with computer security, where we're kind of always running from behind and trying to save what's going on. And a bunch of other sort of assorted projects on, people's internet skill and just generally like how do they interact online and what are the harms they're exposed to and how do we try to keep them safe. So that's sort of a general overview, I guess, of my research, and I would be happy to take questions or direction in terms of what else you'd like me to talk about.
Who was your advisor at College Park?
My advisor was Michelle Mazurek. I was her first PhD student. She came from CMU, and she did a lot of work in her PhD on passwords, and currently she does a lot of work on developers and the kinds of security bugs that they introduce and how to kind of train them not to create those bugs.
Melissa, this is Maxim.
Hi.
Hey, I'm very interested in interdisciplinary combination where machine learning meets with cybersecurity. So I want to ask you, could you tell us a little bit more about how you worked on machine learning and ethics? And I think you mentioned choosing features and how it's important in terms of ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a number of crossovers between security and ML. A lot of the work is in what's called adversarial machine learning, which is looking at how attackers might give adversarial examples to an algorithm in order to try to trick it into misclassifying something. So there's sort of this classic example where I have a picture of a panda, and if I add some adversarial noise to this picture of a panda, a human would still be able to discern that it is a panda, but the classifier might be able to be tricked into thinking it's a stop sign or something like that, which could have implications for, say, autonomous vehicles. If it doesn't recognize the stop sign or it sees a stop sign where there isn't a stop sign, then all of a sudden the person in the car can come to harm. And so that's one kind of classic like machine learning plus security with some ethics in terms of the application problem. There are also a number of ways we could try to use machine learning as a defense tool, which I sort of mentioned briefly, like can we optimize how we defend cyber systems, or can we optimize, say, privacy protections? So there's some work that at the most simple level has looked at, well, if someone installs this tool and it clicks around on ads for them, can it sufficiently confuse the ad inference engine that they have some privacy protection? So that's sort of a defensive use, and you can get a little bit more fancy and more machine learning-y. In terms of the AI and ethics kind of stuff that I've looked at the core of it, it's looking at something called descriptive ethics. So basically in ethics, we have the idea, typically decisions are made normatively, right? So I'm an expert, and I think that the ethical and most useful features to use in this machine learning algorithm are A through F, and so those are the ones I'm going to put in. That doesn't always align with how the population is going to view something. And this goes back to like ethical philosophy around like how do we make laws, right? Is it like the judges who get to decide it because they're experts, or is it people voting on the laws that determine what they are? And so I have looked at how can you get accurate measurements from people about what features they think are fair to include in a classifier, and can you use those perceptions of fairness to then weight the features that you put in the classifier. So if like 70% of the population thinks feature A is fair, but only 20% think feature F is fair, you might drop feature F altogether, or you might adjust the weights in the classifier, not necessarily to optimize accuracy, but to try to optimize both fairness and accuracy simultaneously. And obviously people don't necessarily know like what it means for something to be fair, so we actually broke down the question of fair into 8 underlying properties, and what we find is that people disagree a lot about whether things are fair, but two people who have the same evaluation of the feature on some underlying property, like how relevant it is, how volitional it is, how violating of privacy it is. We have 8 of these things. If we know your sort of matrix of property values, we can predict with over 80% accuracy whether you think something is fair. So basically, people have a very consistent sort of personal classifier or model to go from the properties of this feature to the fairness of the feature. And so you can actually combine some expert judgments about whether something's relevant, or even some machine learning judgments about whether something is causally related to something else, with this human fairness perception function to figure out the fairness of features you might be putting in your model, and then you can optimize over that. So that's an example of one of the problems, and you could use that for security, or you could use it for any kind of classification issue. Someone asked about security and economics. Yes. Okay, so there are a couple of different crossovers. The classic crossover between security and economics is, well, there are 2. One is around cyber insurance. So there are insurance companies, just like there are for everything, that try to insure companies against cyber risks. So like Marriott just had a cyber breach recently, and they probably carry a cyber insurance policy. When Marriott has this cyber breach, maybe they have to give credit monitoring to everyone, or they have to pay for like various types of remediation to deal with this breach, right? And so the cyber insurer is going to kick in because they're going to file a claim with their cyber insurer, and they're going to help Marriott pay for these costs. And cyber insurance companies do a bunch of auditing of the companies that they insure. They have these questionnaires, and that's part of why companies do the security trainings that you experience. If you've ever worked in a company, like they'll make you do this phishing training every so often and various other kinds of training. They partly do that because it reduces their risk, but they also partly do it because it is frequently a requirement of cyber insurance. So there's a bunch of economics and cybersecurity research looking at various pieces of the cyber insurance pipeline, things like, if the stock price of the company goes up, how does that affect their cyber insurance pricing? If they have a breach, how should that affect cyber insurance pricing? And like the tolerance of investors, blah, blah, blah. Very kind of economics and financy stuff. Yes. So that, exactly. Someone just asked about cyber risk and risk management. Yes. So that's like the classic research on security and economics. Another piece of it, I don't do that piece. I sometimes review papers for it, but I don't do that piece. There's another piece of it that has looked at trying to build models of attacker behavior as a way of trying to defend. So basically, if we create like a game theoretic game or model that we think represents attacker behavior and their interaction in a system, can we use that model either to run some theoretical simulations to figure out like patterns in attacker behavior that we can use for defense, or can we even bake that model directly into a defensive system? So there's a lot of research on that. Finally, which there's relatively little research on, there's some looking at end user behavior from an economic perspective. So there was a paper in 2009 that was a theoretical paper by a colleague of mine at Microsoft. And he was basically showing theoretically that it basically doesn't make sense for users to follow advice to behave securely, because they would spend like exponentially more time on listening to all of this advice or implementing these behaviors than their risk of losses. And part of the reason for this was because like bank accounts, for example, are FDIC insured. So even if they were breached in the US, he argued that people in most cases would recover their losses, and therefore the time spent on advice wouldn't be useful. Now, there are some quirks with this model in that obviously to recover the funds, even with FDIC insurance, you have to spend some time trying to do that. And so there's a loss there as well. And there are also some emotional losses where people get upset emotionally from someone breaching their account, even if there isn't a loss. So a lot of my work looks non-theoretically. So I do almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost exclusively empirical work. And so this work that I had done, which actually there's like a short summary on Schneier on security if you read that blog, but basically looked at if I build a system, it's an online system that simulates a bank account. So participants who happen to be crowd workers, they're going to go and create an account in my system. And on this system, they're going to be told their risk of being hacked. So they're going to be told, okay, you've created an account in the system. This account holds, let's say, your hourly wage. You're actually going to get paid that money, but this account has a risk of 20% of being hacked. And then they're invited to enable two-factor authentication. And they're told that two-factor will reduce their risk of hacking by 50%. And they're told that if they get hacked, we're not going to pay them. So they're not going to get paid for the experiment if they get hacked, but if they don't get hacked, they get the full hour wage. And the experiment is only going to take them like 20 minutes, so this is a pretty good deal. And crowd workers are spending all day doing little tiny tasks that pay them like 10 cents. So they're extremely knowledgeable about like their time to payment ratio, which makes them particularly good for these kind of behavioral economics experiments that are incentivized, because offering them, they make about $5 an hour. So offering them $5 or $10 is a pretty big incentive. So anyway, they're in the system. They know the risk of being hacked. They know how much two-factor will protect them, and they have the opportunity to enable it or not. And we have a random number generator on the back end that every day throws out a random number. If it's below a threshold based on their hacking percentage, they don't get hacked. If it's above it, they get hacked, so forth. And basically what we can do is we can show that people don't behave rationally, not shocking. So they don't only enable two-factor with some perfect knowledge of how long it'll take them when it's going to benefit them more than their risk of loss. But they don't behave completely randomly either. They behave boundedly rationally. So what that means is with a small number of factors, which is basically the risk they were told, the protection they were given, what they typically do, so their typical behavior, whether some traditional economic effects like the endowment effect, with those 4 factors, we can predict whether or not they're going to choose to enable two-factor authentication in some future round, with particularly high accuracy for human behavior. And this is useful because this means that we can actually intervene in their behavior. If someone's behaving randomly, it doesn't make much sense to try to intervene with them. And not only does it mean they're not behaving randomly, but it means that if we can be transparent with them about the costs and risks of behaving securely, they're likely to make like a reasonable choice. And so some of my work now is on trying to actually measure the risk that people will have their accounts compromised, which is not the easiest measurement problem, and to try to measure numerically their perception of how likely their accounts are to be compromised in order to sort of flesh out these models in a non-experimental setting. That was sort of a long answer to your question.
What are some of the skills which you found most useful in the success of your career?
Absolutely. So I think a couple of things. So one is in my undergraduate research, I did CS theory research, which is something that when I went into grad school, I thought I wanted nothing to do with. But by the time I was toward the end of it and had gotten kind of back into the economic stuff, it ended up being very useful. And during grad school and even undergrad, I had taken courses on natural language processing and machine learning, and I did a data science fellowship. And all of the skills that I sort of picked up through these things that at the time felt pointless or random, I ended up using. So I actually wrote a natural language processing paper that I presented in a conference where I was measuring how readable security advice was. And if I hadn't taken NLP and hadn't done the data science fellowship, there were a number of projects that I would not have been able to do. So I think sort of a wandering approach to skills was useful, and having sort of a broad skill set was actually useful. These things, you never know when they come in handy, and if you don't know them, you won't think of that possible solution to the problem. So I think that was very useful. From an academic point of view, actually working in marketing, which at the time felt like, oh, I got this CS degree and now I'm doing marketing. Like, that seems weird. That actually ended up being very useful. So I'm pretty active on Twitter, where I have connected with a lot of people, been able to kind of do better networking at conferences, been able to connect with like people who have shared interests, been able to connect with a lot of industry people. I've written a number of op-eds, all skills that I learned when I was a marketing manager for IBM. Slide design, making engaging presentations, all of those have come in enormous use. Like, of skills that I have, they're probably among the most useful. And so that was actually like surprising to me, but you would be amazed how much of science is not marketing in the bad sense, but just making sure that people are aware of the work and that you're able to frame it in a way that connects to them. So like if you're going to speak, like I spoke at Duo Security recently about some of this, like trying to be fair and rational with how we do two-factor authentication. Like if you're going to speak to corporations, being able to frame it in a way that's going to resonate to them at the right kind of level of depth, so that people aren't overwhelmed, etc. That's been a useful skill. And also like writing. Engineers never like when I say that, but writing has also been a very, very useful skill as well.
Well, thank you so much, Alyssa. It's been delightful. I'm really refreshed at the style of your research. It sounds really interesting the way you're combining different fields and looking at interesting new problems with a fresh light.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, and good luck, all of you. I'm sure you'll have amazing careers, and always, you have my website. Feel free to email me if I can be helpful.
Okay, thanks so much.